Hi there, I'm Lou Meyer. I'm your apologetics lecturer, and welcome to this course. This is the renewed version, and hopefully with better graphics and some more input. Just a little bit of background on me. I live in West Auckland, New Zealand. I've got one wife, and I have 3 adult kids. My background is in science, so I did a degree at Massey University many years ago in biochemistry, worked in research for a little while, and after that did some theological training, worked as a youth pastor, worked with an organisation called Scripture Union for 3 years, mainly with high school students. And then subsequent to that, I've been involved with a ministry called Open Air Campaigners, or OAC Ministries. And basically, we're a team of evangelists communicating with all sorts of age groups. So that's a little bit about my background. I got interested in apologetics when I went through some difficult times in my life, and I realized that I needed to have a bit more of an objective basis for my faith, not just a subjective one. And so I began to study. I also had a good friend who was a Jehovah's Witness, and I needed to, he put some questions in my mind as we were discussing things, and I needed to really get sorted out who Jesus is, because that's pivotal to our faith. So there's a little bit of background. I'm going to share with you now about apologetics, and I'm going to share. The good news is you don't get to see my face this big for most of the time. It's locked down here in Auckland, and I've got a broken tooth and I haven't had a haircut, so I'm not looking my best. So it's better if you only see a small shot of me. I'm going to share, excuse me, the PowerPoint presentation for this course, which I don't know how many sections will be in the course, but I'm sharing with you now the PowerPoint presentation. So as we go through the course, I want you to keep in mind that there's going to be a bit of mind study. You're going to have to work a little bit hard with your brain if you're not used to that for a while. And some of us haven't done a lot of thinking since we went to school, and some of us only went to school to eat our lunch. So I'm going to try to break it down as much as I can, but there are some concepts that take a little bit of concentration to get the hang of. You'll have, hopefully, accessible to you the apologetics notes in Word format, so you can follow through on that with me if you want to. Most of what I have up on the screen here will be in those notes, not everything, but most of it. So you can come back to it. So we're going to look at the question of apologetics. Apologetics is really giving a reasoned argument or a reasoned defense for the faith. And in philosophy, when we talk about an argument, we're not talking about a scrap that you have or disagreement that you have with a friend or a member of your family or even somebody else. We're talking about a formal presentation of what you believe to be truth. So don't be put off by the word argument. It's an important word. So arguments, of course, need to be based on evidence. So welcome to this lecture. In the course, we're going to look at the nature and role of apologetics in the life of the Christian and in society. Then we're going to look at the question of the origin of the universe. This is fairly pivotal in our arguments. And then we're going to look at the question of the origin of life on Earth, the concept of creation and evolution. Then we're going to look at the 3 major areas of apologetics. One is the existence of God. Secondly, there's the inspiration and authority of the Bible. And thirdly, there's the person of Jesus Christ, his death and his resurrection. Is it true? Did it happen? What are the implications, perhaps, of that? Then we're going to look at the answers to some questions that are quite common that people come up with in regard to Christianity. And then at the end, we're going to do a session on secular belief systems and their influence in the culture that we're seeking to reach as Christians. So welcome aboard. I hope you enjoy and are stimulated and encouraged by the lectures that we're going to do on apologetics. Okay, the role of apologetics in evangelism. In 1 Peter 3, it talks about to not be, or to always be ready to give an account for what we believe, a reasoned account for what we believe. And that's where the word, from the Greek word apologia, or the word apologetics comes from. It gives reasons for our beliefs, particularly in the context of a culture that doesn't necessarily accept those beliefs. And right from the beginning of Christianity, Christians have basically needed to be apologists. It was Norman Geisler, famous American apologist, who said something like this: as soon as you start sharing your faith, you become an apologist. And that's because people ask you questions, and apologetics is really knowing good answers to those questions. So apologetics is important. One of the things that we need to keep in mind during this course is that we cannot only use apologetics to convince people of the truth of the gospel. People are not really kind of like computers. Some are a bit more like that than others. They don't just sort of take the data in and make the computations and say, okay, Christianity is true. We are emotional beings, we're subjective beings. And I think it's really important for us to understand that the most powerful, in a sense, the most powerful argument for apologetics, for the truth of the gospel, is an authentic Christian life. Peter says in that passage in 1 Peter 3, he says, in your hearts, give Christ that central place as Lord, that key place as Lord. There are various translations that put it in different ways. Sanctify Christ as Lord of your hearts. I think the King James Version says, but give him the rightful place as Lord of your lives. Now, when we do that, our lives become different. The love of Jesus shines through, and people notice the difference that Christ makes in our lives. We become Christ-like, and that causes them to recognize something and to ask questions. So first and foremost, the most powerful apologetic, I believe, is an authentic Christian life lived in the power of the Holy Spirit and overflowing with the love of Jesus. As the world becomes more confused and more self-centered, this shines like a light. So let's keep that in mind. Peter says that when we're giving reasons for the defense, we're to do it with gentleness and respect. And this is important as well, because a lot of people can be, they can consider the arguments, but, you know, I've seen people sort of debating Christianity and giving their evidence, and it's a little bit like, I'm a smarty pants, I know more than you do, ha, 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 aren't I clever? You know, you might win the argument on technicalities, but you lose the person. I mean, nobody's impressed by that sort of nonsense. So we've got to offer the evidence with gentleness and with respect. We've got to treat our competitors in a debate with as much dignity as we possibly can, because that wins the heart of the audience. Maybe not so much their minds, but it wins their hearts. Another thing in apologetics is we need to recognize the power of ideas. Ideas are very important. If I was to ask you what's the most powerful thing in the universe or in the world, you might say, well, maybe atomic energy or something like that. And atomic energy can be very powerful for good or for evil, but it's still not as powerful as the power of ideas. When you look at the impact on the human race of the ideas, the wrong ideas of Darwin, the wrong ideas of Nietzsche, the wrong ideas of Karl Marx, the slaughters that arose from Marxism and Stalinism, Jean-Paul Sartre and Adolf Hitler, and these people who engaged a philosophy which is not a true philosophy, the result of Marxism that we see in communism, the destruction in the world, the destruction in terms of human life is just massive. So ideas are very, very important. Good ideas are important, bad ideas are important too, because they need to be refuted. So it's really important for us as Christians to be able to give answers for why we believe what we believe. There are 4 reasons why it's important to be a thinking and a reasoning Christian. Some people aren't into reasoning, and they say, "Oh, I don't need all that thinking and that reasoning stuff. I just believe." And that might be nice. Their faith is a pretty subjective one. But when challenges come, then just having the feelings of belief are not adequate. And that's what I found. A mature faith has feelings, but those feelings are a response to facts. And if we're just running on feelings, we're really cannon fodder for demons, because feelings can come and feelings can go, and we can be pushed around by life emotionally. So it's important for us to have a thinking and a reasoning faith. First of all, we're commanded to in the Bible, as I've just shared from 1 Peter chapter 3, but we're also given an example. Jesus, in a sense, was an apologist. He was defending his teachings on the basis of the Old Testament. The Apostle Paul was an apologist par excellence, partly because he was the apostle to the Gentiles, and of course the Gentiles have all sorts of belief systems which are nothing to do with Christianity, or very little to do with it. And so apologetics was very important to him. So we're given that example. We will live in a world that's a Gentile world mainly, and so we need apologetics. Thirdly, it strengthens believers. It shows Christians that their faith is true and reasonable and encouraging, and it encourages spiritual growth. It trains people to understand life and spirituality, to see secular influences and their impact on society and even on the church as against biblical patterns. It helps people to understand the importance of a good belief system or a worldview, and how they interpret the world and life. And it also contributes to the health of a culture, not just personal opinion, but rational discussion. Sometimes I listen to talkback radios, and some well-meaning Christians will ring in, but their discussion is not rational, and I'm thinking, oh, please, hang up. You're doing more damage than good. But rational discussion is really important in politics. It's really important in our culture. So I encourage you to become more and more a thinking and a rational believer. But people say, well, what's the relationship between faith and reason? And I want to just share some thoughts from a Christian believer called Dave, a writer, a top apologist. You'll see his picture in a moment. And he says this: skepticism is in fact essential as the first step toward faith, so that long as it doesn't harden into pride or become a cloak for prejudice. Gullibility is no help to true faith, but is actually its enemy. Any religious system which demands faith in its teachings on the basis of its alleged authority, rather than on the basis of hard evidence, and which is unwilling to allow its doctrines and claims to be examined freely by sincere inquiring minds, should not be trusted. The idea that only an elite priesthood or clergy is qualified to determine trust in the area of religion, morals, or faith, and that their dogmas must be accepted unquestioningly, is a lie that has cost multitudes their freedom and peace of mind on earth and damned them for eternity. God himself has said to mankind, come now and let us reason together. That's from Isaiah 1:18. So both faith and reason are important. There's Dave Hunt. He's in heaven now, but he was a great evidence expert and a great anti-cult teacher. He says this: reason and evidence may legitimately point the direction for faith to go in, and must do so. Indeed, faith must not violate evidence and reason, or it would be irrational. Faith takes a step beyond reason, but only in the direction which reason and evidence have pointed. Reason can follow the evidence only so far, and then it finds itself beyond its ability to go any further. It's at this point that faith takes the next step, a step which is beyond the capacity of reason to accompany it, but which is and must be in the direction which evidence and reason have pointed. Well, that fairly wordy approach is actually quite important, because what it's saying is this: reason helps me to distinguish between good and evil, right and wrong. So, for example, if I'm seeking God and truth, it's reason that'll show me that atheism actually doesn't cut it as far as truth claims are concerned. And then as I move forward, then I ask the question, well, all right, if there is a God, then what is the concept of God which is best lines up with reality? So is it Hinduism? Is it pantheism, the belief that everything is God? And it's reason that will show me that actually doesn't work. That can't be true. So I come to theism. And so then I'm left with a number of religions. I'm left with Christianity. I'm left with Judaism. I'm left with Islam. I'm left with Sikhism and maybe Hare Krishnas and things like this. And it's reason that'll help me to distinguish between which of those is the best truth option. So reason weeds out the stuff that's wrong and points me towards what's right, but it can't save me. I need to now apply my faith, my attitude of dependence onto reason and to the Jesus that reason has pointed towards. So that's the relationship, I believe, between reason and faith. It's quite a helpful concept. All righty. And sorry, I've just shot forward here a little bit. So having understood that, we're going to launch into, pardon the pun, space. We're going to ask the question about, what about the origin of the cosmos? Where did everything come from? And we're going to look at some of the options in regard to that. All right. Now, when we're looking at the origin of the cosmos, and when we're looking at the origin at science as it is, we need to understand that there are different kinds of science. The word science actually just means knowledge. Well, we've kind of like closed it in to mean particular areas of experimentation and hypothesis and interpretations. So in a way, you've got really two sort of areas of science, what I call operations science. And this is where you can see something, you can test something. You can, for example, take an object like my mobile phone, and you can do that, and you can repeat it actually. And you can do it there, and you can do it there, and further down. And so that is something you can see and you can test. And as a result of that, you can make a hypothesis. You can say, for example, that I hypothesize that there is an invisible force acting on that mobile phone. When I release the phone, the invisible force accelerates it towards the ground. And for want of a better word, let's call it gravity. Okay, so there you've got a hypothesis based on what some would call empirical evidence, observational evidence, what I call operations science. So now this sort of science doesn't have an opinion about anything. It just presents facts, no explanation. So that's where I've got to make my hypothesis, and I've got to interpret what I'm actually seeing. Now, when we're talking about science too, there is a difference between science that I can see here in my office and the science that has to do with something that happened 100,000, a million years ago. Okay, if there was a million years ago. And so that's historical science. So I can't know those things quite as, or anywhere near really as surely as I can what I can see with my eyes and touch with my hands. There is also distant object science. For example, if something's happening at the other side of the universe, or has happened at the other side of the universe, and I've got light coming from there, which is showing me an event, I can't know with the same amount of preciseness what's going on there, because I don't know the influence that that light has been through on the way to Earth and to my eyeballs. So, and so this is operations science, but some of it is more easily known and some of it isn't. And then the other area of science is what we call scientific interpretation. So this explains what is seen, but it depends on the assumptions that you begin with. Now, let me give you an example from the science of paleontology, the study of fossils. If you were digging in a hill somewhere in Athens, and you were an Athenian living 2,000 years ago, and you found a fossil of a fish in the rocks, you might say, look at this. The gods are having a joke. They've played a joke on us because we know that fish don't swim in mountains. Good one. Wonder which god it was. And of course, they had this whole bunch of gods. Some of them were serious, some of them were scary, some of them were funny. And that was their understanding. That was their belief system. And so they would interpret an event based on the assumptions of their belief system. And the other thing in regard to that is that when a Christian comes along and says, because our belief system, we don't believe in a goofy God who's joking around, but a God who is truth and is interested in declaring truth, then we would interpret that differently and say, look, this has clearly been buried in mud or something, and it's been hardened, fossilized, and so we would our assumption's different, so our interpretation is different. Now, I need to warn you that there is an area of science, and this is particularly seen in regard to the questions of the origin of life, where areas of researchers, areas of study, will actually disallow, they will censor any interpretations that are different to theirs. They'll say, well, that's not science. And for example, and we'll get onto this a little bit more probably later, but they will say, you must explain everything in terms of only natural processes. This is called methodological naturalism, bit of a mouthful. But you're only allowed to have an interpretation based on natural processes. So you can't let God in the door. You got to account for everything without anything metaphysical, paranormal, supernatural, spiritual. Okay. So what they've done is that they have limited themselves because they don't want to consider those other options. They've limited themselves. They've actually been very dishonest with science, but that's what goes on in the modern world. And it's not good science at all. So a good detective considers all aspects of the evidence, not just some of it. So anyway, understand that about science. Now, it's really interesting that the Christian worldview, the belief system that we have based on the biblical concept of God from the Old Testament and the New Testament, that provided the foundations for the development of modern science. And many of the greatest earliest scientists were creationists. And one of the most famous, of course, was that fellow there, Sir Isaac Newton, who sort of kind of discovered and described gravity, and among other things. So here's a bit of a list of some of the creationist pioneers of science. People who believed in God and believed that God made a sensible world, that God instituted sensible laws that defined it. And so you've got Lister, you've got Pasteur, you've got Newton. You can read, I'll let you read the rest, and the various areas of science and discovery that these people have been involved with. And what this does is it just tells us that it's, because some people will give the impression that if you believe in God, you've kind of switched your brain off. And my attitude is, based on the evidence that I'm intending to show you, some of it, that if you actually fail to believe in God, you've committed intellectual suicide. Because I intend to show that the evidence best points to the existence of a God that can be defined in the Judeo-Christian concept. Now, we need to understand in science that we can't prove things 100%. In science investigations, there can be always things which escape our knowledge, but we can, and no scientist works on total 100% evidence, none. Okay, because there can be always that element that they have not considered. But what we work on is the greatest evidence, and we base it on what we see operating in the real world. So it's important for us to recognize, people say, can you prove God? Well, not in the same sense that I can prove to you that my mobile phone is here. But I can give evidence that is best interpreted on the basis of an intelligent being that brought the universe and life into existence. So we move forward. So there are two particular belief systems that scientists have. One is what we call the naturalistic worldview. So this is either based on the idea that God does not exist, and that we call atheism, or that God has been remote since the first ignition step. So this is called deism, D-E-I-S-M. And it's the belief that God got the universe underway and then he left it to itself. He's not involved, he's not interested. Or he's just watching as a remote observer. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for saying that that's not the case, but that's another issue. The second is the divine activity worldview, which is based on the idea that God has been active in creation to the completion of the universe and of life. So those are the two main belief systems. So if you only look at the world through naturalistic eyes, won't allow anything else, you will filter out some of the evidence. You'll pretend it's not there, and you'll end up with an evolutionary perception. If you allow the idea that God, that there is a God who is intelligent, who is beyond the universe, who is above the universe, over the universe, throughout the universe, well, then it will become overwhelmingly, I believe, obvious that there has been divine activity behind the world and the universe. Now, in the belief system of the modern world, and this is from 1994, so it's pretty old now, but I thought it was quite well expressed by Alex Mitchell in his London notebook in the Sun Herald in Sydney. So he's describing belief systems, and he says this: before Darwin, the ruling view of human history in the Western Christian society is based on the mythology. Notice he calls it mythology, so he's not a believer, of the Old Testament's book of Genesis, namely the solitary supreme being, God, created the earth and everything in it in 6 days and rested on the Sabbath. Adam and Eve were the mother and father to the whole of humanity. Now, it's interesting, just by way of reflecting on this, that science, of course, has now confirmed that all mankind, all human beings on the world, come from one man and one woman. So, but Mitchell didn't accept this, obviously. Darwin demolished the metaphysical conception of nature. What does that mean? Well, he says he set human minds free from the notion of a divine, omnipotent power which governed natural existence. In other words, he's suggesting that Darwin got rid of God. And this is said by others, like Richard Dawkins, that Darwin enabled atheists, to be intellectually fulfilled, that you can be an atheist and feel intellectually okay about it. So that's what a lot of people believe in the world. And I believe that we can refute that, but that's giving expression of what a lot of people on our planet actually believe. Now, these assumptions, or what people want to believe, and that's an important element, they will affect the way people interpret science, but also the way they interpret science can affect their belief system and their worldview. So if you interpret science naturalistically, then you're likely to be an agnostic or an atheist. If you interpret science theistically, then I think you'll find a lot of confirmation that others will either not notice or deliberately overlook for the existence of God. Now, it's interesting when we go into the first two chapters of the Bible, we discover that the fundamental pillars of society are found there. So you've got the purpose of life. Now, that's maybe not explicit or implicit, but if God created us, as Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 describes, which I believe, well, then nothing is created without a purpose. So we have a purpose. Everything has a purpose. And the next pillar is authority. What gives me authority over the planet? What gives me authority to go deer hunting, and deer don't have the authority to go me hunting? One of the reasons, or main reason, is because God gave us authority, as in the first chapters of the Bible, to look after this planet, not to destroy it, but to look after it. And those deer can certainly ruin a lot of bush. Human identity. What gives us our identity as human beings? What makes us significant? And the next one is tied up to this. What makes human life sacred? The sanctity of life. What makes you and I more significant or more important than a blowfly, a mosquito, or a sheep? And the answer, of course, is that we were made in the image of God. We bear the stamp of our Maker in a way that other creatures don't. So our human life is sacred, and that's taught in Genesis chapter 9 too, where God says that he puts the death penalty on anybody who takes innocent human life, because it is sacred. You know, it's like taking the Queen's photo and burning it. It's worse than that, of course, but it's sacred. And then we have the question of sexual identity. God made them male and female. The completeness of his image was seen in both the male and the female, and not them trying to figure out which they were, but it was God that gave mankind his sexual identity in the creation, and something significant happens. In creation, God separated woman from man. He didn't do that with any other animals, as far as we see. He separated woman from man, made some very pleasing variations, and and in the marriage act, which is partly physical, he brings man and woman back together, not only in a physical oneness that we call intercourse, but also at a soulish level and even a spiritual level. What was separated at creation becomes one. Now, God never separated man from man at creation, so the idea of man and man coming together and being one is foreign to the Bible. And the idea of woman and woman being separated and becoming one is foreign to the Bible. So marriage, as far as our Creator is concerned, is a man and a woman being united and becoming one. So the foundation of marriage is there as well. And the other thing is that the concept of rest is there. Now, we know this from experience that, you know, if we just work day after day and don't get any rest, we lose the ability to perform to our best. We compromise and we become exhausted. So we are unable to live up to our potential. And one day a week of rest is a great concept. And that's the one that God gives us an example of in creation. And then implicitly again, life beyond death is there. Because if God made a wonderful, perfect creation and he gave us authority over it. And let's face it, it's not perfect now, but it's still amazingly beautiful in most of the world. If he gave us a perfect creation and created that, could he not make another one or renew this one to a perfection? Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you. The Bible teaches that there is a brand new universe coming, and God is designing it for those who love him. Now, if he didn't make this universe, but it kind of evolved through random processes, why would we imagine that he could make another one? But if he did create this universe, of course, it's a piece of cake for God to do it again. You very rarely find one builder that can build one house but can never build another. And he'd need his arms to be broken or his head to be removed to not be able to do that, or to be severely damaged. So God is quite capable of making new heavens and new earth, and he's promised to do that. So we can accept and expect that there is life beyond the grave. Now in our society of New Zealand and in the Western world, in fact, most of the world, where people have dumped the idea of God, as it describes in Romans chapter 1, these foundations of our belief systems, of our society, have been just done away with. And the world's becoming more confused and more of a mess. People don't understand the purpose of life. To them, there's no purpose. So if it doesn't work for them, check out, commit suicide. People don't understand authority, that God has given us authority over some things. People don't understand human identity, where we're slaughtering, butchering babies in the womb. That is just horrific, because we're not recognizing the sanctity of life. We're killing off old people because we don't recognize the sanctity of life. And sexual identity, people are growing up and they don't, they might go through some ambivalence as to their DNA determined gender. But there's stuff going on at the moment which is just utterly confusing young people. And in fact, everybody in our government at the moment is talking about changing the passports so that your gender isn't on there. Or there are a number of different genders. That just doesn't make any sense. But it's what happens. Romans 1 says when they dump the concept of God in their thinking becomes futile. And it just doesn't work properly. And this is exactly what we see going on in society. People are not bothering to get married. They don't understand the importance and what marriage actually says and is. And of course, children have been brought up outside of marriage with the insecurities that go along with that and the broken families that go along with that. People are not taking a day off as they should, so that they're becoming more and more, having more and more mental health problems, getting enough sleep, enough rest, obsessed with making money, work. And of course, a lot of people don't believe in anything after this life, so they've got to get it all now. So they become humanists and existentialists, and they work for pleasure, live for pleasure, and their lives are confusing. So we can see the mess that happens when we move away from a biblical belief system, and it's exactly what's going on in the world today. And what people have done is they've taken God's perfect word, and which Jesus acknowledged as being the truth. Thy word is truth, in John chapter 17. They've taken man's fallible opinion, evolutionary science, which is forever changing. And I believe that evolution is now a dead theory, but a lot of people don't want to bury it yet. And you can get hold of my book, What Killed Evolution, my little book, if you'd like to, and read about that. So what happens is that they tried to chop bits out of the Bible, like Genesis 1, Genesis 2, to try to make them agree with evolutionary science. But evolutionary science is changing. And when you do violence to the word of God, you're actually doing something very, very serious. This is a picture of Pastor Joseph Ton, in his more mature years. And he wrote an article that was in the Slavic Gospel Association magazine in 1981 when the country that he lived in Europe was communist. And it was Romania. It says this: I was coming from a place where the churches were being refined through suffering, yet they were packed with hearts on fire for the Lord. I received the shock of my life when I saw churches in London almost empty. I heard ministers saying how they had pondered quitting the ministry, discouraged and defeated in a losing battle. And he says this: from the turn of the century, that's last century, the 20th century, when 85% of the population every Sunday were in church, now only 5% attended. So in 100 years, from 85% to 5%, that's an 80% loss in people who attended church. He says, I came to the conclusion that there were two factors which destroyed Christianity in Western Europe. One was the theory of evolution, and the other liberal theology. Liberal theology is just evolution applied to the Bible and our faith. Now, liberal theology, just to explain, is theology which denies the supernatural in the Bible. It tries to interpret the Bible through naturalistic processes. And you can't do that. It just doesn't make sense. And of course, that offends the Holy Spirit. And that's why churches that are liberal are dying in their droves. Because when you offend the Holy Spirit, why would you expect him to support your church? Why would you want him to bring new believers into your mixture of belief and unbelief? You know, the Bible says when the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? And I believe as communicators of the Christian faith, what we can do is relay the foundations, put them down good and strong. It's a great time to be a Christian. There is so much evidence. There are so many clever apologetists who give us good answers to the questions. So some of the questions we're going to look at, and starting in the next session, is the Bible scientifically trustworthy? Now, we know that the Bible is a science textbook, as you would see a science textbook today. It was a book written primarily for the ancient world, but God foreknowing that we would be reading it as well. So is it trustworthy? What does the Bible say about the beginning of the universe? What does naturalistic scientific opinion say about the beginning of the universe? What does the Bible say about the origin of life on Earth? And what does naturalistic scientific opinion say about the origin of life on Earth? So in the next session, we're going to look at some of these principles. Till then, stay well, take care. Thank you.